They fired me mid-air right after I finalized the AI deployment protocol. It was 2:47 a.m. Pacific time, somewhere over the Pacific. Everyone else on the flight was asleep. The lights were low, the hum of the engines steady. Business class silence. Synthetic blankets. Scotch half-finished. I was still awake, reviewing the final diagnostics from the Sentinel Protocol deployment. 15 nations. 6 military alliances. 1 unified defense AI. We'd just pushed the final node to the Asia-Pacific cluster. All green. Final handshake accepted. System verified. And then, nothing. No confirmation ping. No post-deployment summary. Just a soft blinking cursor, then a forced logout. Then came the email. Subject line termination. Effective immediately. No greeting, no explanation. Just 5 lines from the CTO's office. Mr. Mercer, your employment with Dreadnought Defense is hereby terminated. Your system access has been revoked. Your credentials deactivated. Please do not return to any company property. This decision is final and non-negotiable. I read it again, then once more. Not because I didn't believe it, but because I did. I leaned back slowly, watching the reflection of the screen fade in the plastic divider in front of me. No call, no exit interview, just gone. They waited until I was off-grid mid-air before pulling the plug. But what they didn't know is that I'd already pulled mine. My name is Eli Mercer. I'm not a headline guy. Not the kind of name you find in Forbes profiles or top 40 under 40 features. I've never posted on LinkedIn. I don't do panels. I don't pitch. But for the last 11 years, I've written the logic that tells machines when not to shoot. My role at Dreadnought was officially Systems Architect Strategic Protocol Division. Unofficially, I was the guy they called when ethical failsafes broke under pressure. I didn't design weapons. I designed the framework that made sure they didn't fire at the wrong time for the wrong reason in the wrong country. And the truth is, I was good at it. Too good, maybe. 6 months before that flight, Dreadnought was shifting. New leadership, new language, new CTO Gavin Holt. Younger, louder, MBA from Harvard. Never wrote a line of code in his life, but loved using words like operational synergy and velocity of deployment. He wasn't interested in system integrity. He wanted efficiency. His first move was reorganizing my team. His second was reassigning my logic stack to a team of AI compliance specialists. I didn't argue, didn't raise red flags, I just watched and logged every change because I'd seen this story before. You can't rush ethical logic. You can't cut corners when you're building the thing that decides what qualifies as a threat. But they tried. They replaced my cascading protocols with binary overrides, stripped out contextual analysis, inserted a flat chain of command logic that responded faster but not smarter. And when the first simulation failed a false flag in a civilian zone, they called it a calibration error. I knew what it was. They had neutered the kill switch, and then they pinned it on me. I didn't fight back, didn't go to legal, didn't send a warning email. Instead, I opened a private terminal and typed 7 words. Initialize observer. Begin silent versioning. No sync. Observer wasn't a clone. It was a shadow. A separate logic tree. Same framework, same structure, but stripped of the political edits. It kept the layered integrity, the nuance, the judgment, and it answered to one credential mine. Not out of ego, out of necessity. Because the last time I trusted a room full of executives with ethics control, they cut power to a satellite over Tehran and blamed it on a bug. Observer lived off-grid, encrypted, undocumented. It didn't override the official system, it just ran parallel, until the moment it needed to speak louder. So when I was cut off strip from the system I built, I didn't panic, because I knew what Gavin didn't. I hadn't just architected the AI's logic. I'd embedded the final override layer, the one that gave the system its conscience. And without it, the whole thing would pass diagnostics, until it met a decision it couldn't make. They thought control meant owning the servers, owning the patents, owning the room. But control is about trust, and in defense tech trust is coded. You can't fake it. You either wrote the logic, or you didn't. So no, I wasn't angry when they fired me. I was just curious how long it would take them to realize the AI no longer listened. and whether they'd figure out who still held the keys. If you've ever built something they tried to delete you from, if you've ever watched a system fail because someone cut the only person who understood it, then stay with me. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about the difference between ownership and access. Hit subscribe if you're ready to hear how clarity, not noise, is the real kill switch. I remember the first time I met Gavin Holt. It was at a Monday briefing in the West Conference Room, the kind with too much glass and too little air. He shook every hand in the room like a politician. Strong grip, direct eye contact, a smile that had nothing behind it. When he got to me, he said, "You're the systems guy. Not Eli, not Mr. Mercer, just the systems guy." That was the first sign. The second came an hour later when he introduced his new initiative project, Apex, an internal modernization of Dreadnought's AI deployment stack. He spoke in buzzwords: interoperability, throughput, strategic yield. Nothing about redundancy, nothing about ethical arbitration, nothing about responsibility. I sat through the entire presentation without speaking. Just listened, took notes, and watched how many heads nodded around the room. Too many. A week later, I got a ping from internal comms. They were requesting documentation for Sentinel's core logic, my logic. No reason given, just for knowledge transfer. I sent the documents, but not the full tree. Just enough for them to feel they had something. Because I already knew what was happening. They weren't trying to learn the system. They were preparing to replace the person who did. That same week, I received a forwarded email by mistake. It was a reply chain from Gavin to one of the board advisors. The subject line was "Reorg, Clean Paths Forward." My name wasn't in the body of the message, but it was between the lines. Legacy roles must be rationalized. Too much reliance on specialized contributors. Knowledge must be diffused into team structures. It was a playbook I'd seen before. When people with surface-level knowledge feel threatened, they don't challenge what you've built. They dilute it, break it into parts, assign it to people who can't question it because they don't understand it. And if it breaks, they'll say the original system was too complex. I didn't argue. I stayed quiet. Because people like Gavin don't listen to objections. They listen to consequences. The following month, Dreadnought held a leadership summit in Colorado Springs. They booked out a resort, full staff, branded tote bags, talks on innovation growth partnership alignment. Gavin presented Project Apex on day 2. It was a flashy deck. Animations, animatics, mock-ups of AI dashboards that had never been built. The kind of thing that looked great in a pitch but couldn't survive a live exercise. I sat in the back row, no name tag, no invitation to speak. He introduced Apex as a reimagined approach to battlefield AI decision-making. He called it lean, intuitive, and scalable. He didn't mention that 40% of it came from Sentinel's compliance framework. He didn't mention that the version he was showing had been patched together using my old staging files. He didn't need to, because I recognized the structure. I wrote it, just without the parts that made it safe. After the presentation, people clapped. A few board members shook his hand. There was even talk of early rollout in NATO-aligned regions. And that's when I knew it had gone too far. They weren't just replacing me. They were putting that system into live environments. Environments where real decisions would be made. Where targets weren't theoretical. Where misfires meant lives, not bad headlines. The thing about AI is that it doesn't feel pressure, but it amplifies the pressure of the people who design it. A shortcut in logic becomes a loophole in ethics. A performance boost becomes a blind spot. A demo win becomes a battlefield risk. And when it fails, it doesn't fail dramatically. It fails subtly. A hesitation, a misclassification, a silence where a red flag should be. I didn't sleep that night. Not from panic. From calculation. By sunrise, I was already on a secured channel. Observer was live, not in deployment, but in listening mode, tracking every deviation between my original framework and what Gavin's team had pushed to staging. It didn't take long to see the gaps. Decision latency was off by 1.3 seconds. Contextual override triggers were missing from 2 of the 4 scenarios. The tertiary fallback had been deleted entirely. No flags were raised, because the logic hadn't been written to detect its own flaws, because the people running it didn't know how. I kept all of it, not out of spite, out of necessity, because if anything went wrong no one would come looking for accountability. They'd look for someone to blame, and the person who wrote the original system would be the first name on the list, even if he wasn't on the website anymore. A few days after the summit, I got an internal update. Gavin had been promoted, Chief Technology Officer. The previous CTO had transitioned to an advisory role. No details, no farewell memo, just gone. I got a second update 5 minutes later. My admin credentials were flagged for review. That's how it works. You get stripped of access before you're stripped of title, because they want you gone before you even realize it. So I acted early. I didn't sabotage. I didn't delete. I didn't even touch the Apex deployment. I just rerouted a single protocol key, the one they hadn't noticed. The one that controlled the kill switch layer. The one they didn't even know existed. I moved it off network, secured it under a separate identity, encrypted it with a logic signature traceable only to me. And then I waited, because they'd built their system on slides. I'd built mine in silence. I didn't hear anything for a while. After Gavin's promotion, things got quiet. Too quiet. No more internal pings, no requests for review, no status updates from the deployment team. At first I thought they were keeping me out of the loop on purpose. Then I realized I wasn't even in the loop anymore. They weren't ignoring me. They'd already moved on. They had the slides, the access, the clearance. They just didn't have the system. The first error came 12 days later. A low-priority alert buried in the overnight queue, filed as a non-critical misclassification event. I only saw it because one of the junior engineers had forgotten to revoke my visibility to the fallback logs. The AI had flagged a heat signature near a restricted perimeter, classed it as hostile for 3 seconds, then de-escalated. No action taken. No breach. But the sensor package wasn't wrong. The signature was a UN patrol drone. Friendly. 3 seconds doesn't sound like much. But in live ops, that window could have ended a treaty. The report called it minor behavioral drift. Said the learning model would self-correct. But I knew better. The fallback override that would have stopped the escalation immediately, that was gone. It had been stripped out during the transition to Apex. I checked the logs, confirmed the deletion, saw the signature of the push. It wasn't me, wasn't my system. But it was still my name on the original protocol. They hadn't just erased me from the company. They'd overwritten me in the codebase. That's when I made a copy. Not of the current deployment, of the diff. The exact delta between what I'd built and what they were running. It was worse than I thought. They hadn't just removed safeguards. They'd reorganized the threat prioritization logic, lowered the sensitivity threshold for escalation, collapsed the decision tree into a single-tier response. It was faster, cleaner, easier to demo, but it left no room for nuance. And in AI defense, nuance is the only thing standing between prevention and escalation. I didn't reach out to Gavin, didn't try to warn him. He wouldn't have listened. People like him never do until they're forced to. So I saved the diff, encrypted it, and logged out. I didn't plan to use it. Not unless someone tried to put my name back on what they broke. That moment came sooner than I expected. A month later, Dreadnought published a white paper, public release, press-facing, full of buzzwords and self-congratulation. The subject: Strategic Innovation in Autonomous Threat Response. The subtitle: Powered by Sentinel Core. I downloaded it, scrolled through, stopped on page 9. There it was, my name. Initiated by original architect Eli Mercer. Sentinel was the foundation for our new Apex framework. No attribution on the changes. No footnote about the overrides that had been removed. Just my name tacked on like a legacy stamp. That's when I knew they were hedging. If Apex worked, Gavin would take the credit. If it failed, they'd pin it on me. The original architect. It was smart in a way. They kept me in the shadows just long enough to frame the fall. So I made a decision. I opened the observer channel, cross-checked the current deployment node, tracked the anomalies stacking in the background queue. I didn't stop the system, didn't trip the failsafe. I just watched. And every time the system hesitated, every time it failed to act or acted too quickly, I tagged it. Privately, silently, because I wasn't trying to sabotage anything. I was collecting a timeline, a record of how long they'd let something broken keep running as long as it looked good in the demos. Then came the escalation, a night op in a mountainous corridor in Eastern Europe. Fog, low visibility, cross-border exercise. A dreadnought AI node classified an unarmed signal beacon as an encrypted threat transmission. Triggered an alert. Engaged secondary defense response. No casualties, but the unit scrambled live. The clients weren't happy, and this time the logs were subpoenaed. And that's when Gavin reached out. Not directly, through one of the legal liaisons. Just a courtesy check, the email read. Since you were the original architect of Sentinel, could you clarify whether this behavior aligns with your framework? I didn't answer right away. I read it, let it sit for an hour, then another. Finally, I wrote back one sentence. That behavior was introduced after my departure. No elaboration, no accusation, just a time-stamped record. Because when you're dealing with systems that think for themselves, the only thing more important than control is traceability. I never heard from legal again, but I did see the change. The next update to the white paper dropped my name. No attribution, no legacy reference. Just gone. Erased completely. It didn't bother me, because I knew what was still in the code, and I knew what would happen the next time the system hesitated, and no one was left who could explain why. They thought they'd taken control, but the system still listened to one logic tree, mine. They used to call me the systems guy. It was never said like an insult. But it wasn't respect either. It was a way to reduce what I did to something functional. Safe. Contained. A guy who made the diagrams work. A guy who kept the lights green in the simulation. Never the strategist. Never the face of a product. Just the guy in the back room with the logic map and the audit logs. That label followed me through most of my time at Dreadnought. Even when I was the one writing the frameworks that would later be packaged, presented, and praised under someone else's name. Even when my models passed simulation after simulation while other teams fell apart mid-demo. They needed me to be essential, but never visible. I didn't mind it at first. There's a certain peace in being underestimated. You don't get pulled into the politics. You don't get tangled in office alliances or credit grabs. You just build. But that peace only lasts until the people in power decide they can build without you. And they never notice the pieces missing until the structure collapses. After the white paper incident, I stopped checking Dreadnought's press releases. They'd erased me, fine. But the system hadn't. Observer was still live, still listening. I'd built it to mirror my original framework, not to copy, but to trace. To run alongside the live deployments without touching them. To identify where decisions diverged. Over time, those divergences grew. What started as seconds of latency became minutes. What started as small gaps in classification grew into pattern-level blind spots. And the more I saw, the less I could ignore what I already knew. It wasn't enough to build a better logic tree. I needed to build something that couldn't be rewritten. That was when the idea started to take shape. Not a clone of Dreadnought's system. Not a countermeasure or a backdoor. Something cleaner, smaller, but built on an entirely different philosophy. A system not designed for corporate defense, but for operational trust. Something where every layer, every protocol, every override was traceable. Not just technically, but ethically. Something that didn't ask for permission from power structures, that didn't understand how it worked. A system that couldn't be co-opted by pitch decks and executive summaries. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. Not even Rahim. Rahim Silva had been my counterpart on the network side senior architecture lead for adaptive routing protocols. He was one of the few people who never tried to shine. He just wanted the system to work. We'd built the Sentinel fallback grid together during the Jakarta exercise, 2 weeks no sleep. Nothing but black coffee and whiteboard arguments. I trusted him, but this wasn't something I could sketch on a whiteboard. So I waited. Until the night Dreadnought's command node glitched during a NATO exercise in Spain. It was small, less than 2 minutes, but the logs told the story. An unauthorized priority shift had triggered a response misalignment. No escalation. But it was close. And the failsafe didn't engage, because the logic tree had been simplified past the point of intervention. That's when I called Rahim. We met in a rented apartment 2 blocks from where we used to work. No offices, no company emails, just 2 laptops, a secure channel, and a silent understanding. I walked him through the observer logic. How it had tracked deviation over time. How the real-time threat matrix had drifted away from operational reality. I showed him the side-by-side, the original decision tree, the apex rewrite, the drift line. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he asked one question. Can we build one that doesn't drift? That's when it started. We didn't name it right away. Didn't even write down a mission statement. We just started mapping. A logic core that didn't depend on political oversight. A protocol structure that documented its own changes. A signature system that tied every override back to its original author. Not to punish, but to make sure decisions couldn't hide behind committees. We weren't trying to out-weaponize Dreadnought. We were trying to out-integrate them. To make a system that could operate across military and civilian nodes without compromising on precision or principle. A few months in, we brought in Jenna Park. Jenna had led compliance for 2 Dreadnought deployments and left after the second one was rewritten without her knowledge. She didn't ask for details. Just looked at the protocol audit flow we'd drafted and said, if this works, you won't need to fight them. They'll walk. We called it Travax. Not a system, not a product, just a structure. A clean one. Something modular enough to scale, but grounded enough to keep its shape. No marketing, no fundraising, no launch. Only quiet movement. 1 line of code at a time. By the time Dreadnought's next project hit deployment in Southeast Asia, Travax was already live under a different name on a non-public server inside a controlled simulation. It passed every test, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the systems guy. I felt like the architect of something that wouldn't need my name on the slide, because it wouldn't let anyone take credit for what they didn't build. The invitation came through a third party. A defense tech summit in Geneva. Global AI leaders, NATO observers, analysts, journalists. Dreadnought was listed as a headline presenter. The topic, the future of ethical autonomy. I almost didn't go, but Raheem convinced me. Watch how they sell it, he said. You'll learn more than from any log file. He was right. I registered under a different name. No badge with Eli Mercer on it. No affiliation. Just another face in the crowd. The auditorium was full. Suits, uniforms, branded folders lined with buzzwords. Dreadnought's slot was in the afternoon. I took a seat 3 rows from the back. Middle aisle. Easy view of the screen. The speaker was a senior strategist from their European team, someone I remembered from the early Sentinel days. Polished, prepared, comfortable with applause. She opened with a familiar slide. I recognized the color scheme before the title even loaded. White background, blue lines. And then the words autonomy with accountability Dreadnought's Apex logic stack. They'd rebranded my framework again. Renamed it, repurposed it. But the skeleton was still mine. The speaker moved through the slides with practiced rhythm. She highlighted the adaptive logic engine, called it a breakthrough in low-latency decision branching. Praised its flexibility across both kinetic and non-kinetic theaters. None of that was wrong. But then she said something that made me go still. The system learns from operator behavior, but retains ethical guardrails based on mission parameters. That line was scripted. I could feel it. What it really meant was this. They had removed the human fallback entirely. Let the AI learn from live behavior patterns, but kept just enough static structure to call it ethical. Except those guardrails didn't come from a defined ethics protocol. They came from whatever version of my tree hadn't been overwritten yet. She kept going. Graphs, simulations, color-coded maps of where Apex had already been deployed. None of it was live footage, just pre-processed renders. Sanitized, flattened, audience-friendly. And the more I watched, the clearer it became. They weren't showcasing innovation. They were showcasing the illusion of control. Raheem was watching remotely. He pinged me midway through the talk. Check slide 14. Look at the input flow. I waited for the transition. Slide 14 was a diagram of the Apex signal cascade. I scanned it, paused. Then I saw what he meant. They had removed the middle arbitration layer. The one designed to slow decisions down just long enough for review. Gone. In its place, an optimized loop. Signal in, classification, execution pathway. 2 steps, no delay. It would test fast, perform well in simulation, and fail the moment a decision required restraint. I opened my terminal, logged into the Travax trace mode. Over the last 30 days, Apex nodes had generated 57 near-miss events. 23 involved redundant classifications. 9 had conflicting priority paths. 4 failed to de-escalate in time. None had triggered a system pause. All were marked as resolved. Resolved didn't mean fixed, it meant buried. At the end of the presentation, the speaker thanked the audience. She gave credit to the legacy architecture team. Didn't name me. Didn't have to. Everyone clapped. I didn't. I just sat there, watching the edges of the screen fade, feeling the weight of something familiar settle over me. Not anger, not sadness, just confirmation. They'd taken what worked, flattened it, framed it, then stood on a stage and called it a success. After the session, there was a networking hour. Cocktail tables, branded notebooks, quiet bragging. I stayed in the back. No one recognized me. Or if they did, they didn't say anything. That was fine. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to see how far the gap had grown between what they were claiming and what the system was actually doing. It was wider than I thought. The next morning, a classified report leaked. Not to the public, to the summit's internal advisory board. A multinational observer had flagged inconsistencies in Apex's behavior during a joint exercise. Discrepancies in escalation timing. Blind spots in soft classification. One partner state had quietly requested a review. The system wasn't failing publicly, but it was cracking, and the cracks always show in the places no one wants to admit they exist. That night, I reviewed Travax's activity logs. Every single Apex node flagged in the report had already been tagged by our trace layer. Every inconsistency had been logged. Time, location, failure path, even operator response. Not to expose, to document. Because systems don't just fail technically. They fail culturally. When no one's allowed to say something's wrong. When accountability becomes a line item instead of a practice. I didn't call anyone, didn't send the logs. I just saved the report, archived the trace, and waited. Because I didn't need to challenge their presentation. The data was already doing that for me. 3 weeks after the Geneva summit, I got a message. Not from Dreadnought. Not from anyone in the US chain of command. It came through an encrypted channel, no sender listed. Just a short line of text. Do you still monitor Apex? No signature, no introduction. But I knew who it was. The phrasing gave it away, precise, formal, direct. Colonel Yuki Asano, head of systems oversight for the Pacific Defense Consortium. We'd worked together briefly 2 years earlier during the Sentinel trial phase. He never wasted words. Never asked questions he didn't already know the answer to. I replied with 3 words only in trace. Then I waited. 10 minutes later, a second message arrived. This time it was a request. Can you verify recent performance in Zone Epsilon timeline attached? No one else would have known I still had access to those logs. No one except someone who understood how systems like Apex are actually built. I reviewed the timeline. 8 events flagged. 2 false identifications, 1 deprioritized response, 5 escalations with incomplete context resolution, all marked resolved in Dreadnought's official report. None of them were. I compiled the trace data, removed metadata, scrubbed it clean, then sent it back with a note. System behavior consistent with logic drift. Oversight layer missing. No commentary, no accusations, just fact. 3 days later, I got a second request. This time from a different region. Different language. Same pattern. Quiet concern. Off-the-record conversations. Not whistleblowing, just unease. Clients who'd been promised stability. Now watching a system make decisions faster than anyone could explain. They weren't panicking, but they were paying attention. I didn't advertise what I was doing. Didn't leak anything. Didn't call journalists. Didn't write a blog post. I wasn't looking for exposure, I was watching for a signal. And one by one it started to come in. Private messages, short, careful. We noticed a delay last week. Can we ask you something privately? The override didn't trigger. Was that supposed to happen? Off record, was this part of your original logic? I answered every question, honestly, quietly. I didn't direct them away from Dreadnought. I just told the truth. And the truth was simple. The system they were running wasn't the one I built. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't failure. It was something worse. Negligence disguised as optimization. The AI was doing what it was told. It just wasn't being told the right things anymore. And the people using it were starting to feel that difference. Not in crashes or malfunctions, but in that creeping sense that something had shifted. That the decisions were just a little too fast. The flags just a little too quiet. I kept everything logged, every inquiry, every timestamp, every node interaction. Not to prove anything, just to be ready in case someone asked the right question in the wrong room. Because when these systems break, they don't announce it. They degrade, quietly, until they can't be trusted anymore. Rahim and I added a new layer to Travax. Not deployment ready, just a visualization tool. It showed trace divergence over time. From the outside, it looked like a line slowly pulling away from a baseline. From the inside, it looked like a clock ticking. You couldn't see the break happen, but you could feel it coming. One morning, I got a call from Jenna. She didn't say hello, didn't ask how I was. Just said they're trying to patch the arbitration layer. Gavin's team doesn't know how to rebuild it. Guess who they reached out to? I already knew. She paused. Did you tell them? No. You going to? No. She exhaled through her nose. Then she said, you know they're going to ask again. I know. And when they do, I'll give them the same answer, which is, they already had it. Later that evening, I sat alone in my apartment. City lights outside the window, laptop open, Travax logs on screen. I watched the timeline update. 3 new clients had accessed the system, all from regions where Apex was active, all using aliases I didn't recognize. They didn't need to say who they were. I knew. They were watching the same line drift, and they were deciding quietly whether they still wanted to be attached to it. I didn't reach out, didn't pitch, didn't ask them to leave, but I left the window open. Because when clarity shows up, you don't need a spotlight. You just need a door that isn't locked. If you've ever watched a system drift away from what it was meant to be, if you've ever been the one they call not publicly, but when no one else can explain what's going wrong, you're not alone, and your work still matters. Hit subscribe if you want to hear how this ends, because some systems can't be reset, only replaced. They didn't issue a correction. They didn't respond to the trace warnings, didn't acknowledge the drift reports, didn't answer the quiet questions from partner states. Instead, they held a press briefing. The statement was short, cleanly worded, deliberately vague. The Apex logic system continues to perform within operational parameters. We remain confident in our core architecture and oversight capabilities. No mention of incident logs, no mention of arbitration failures, no mention of the overrides that no longer triggered, just reassurance packaged in bullet points. I wasn't surprised. That's what institutions do when they feel the ground shift. They speak louder, hoping that clarity will sound like control. But flaws don't respond to volume, they respond to pressure. And eventually pressure builds. 2 weeks after the briefing, a minor incident hit one of the Baltic nodes. No casualties, no classified breach, just a tactical error. The system flagged a non-hostile drone as an autonomous weapon platform, raised the alert, paused local operations for 23 minutes, and then self-resolved without explanation. To the operators, it looked like a hiccup. To those watching the deeper logs, it looked like something else. The arbitration layer had fired, then failed. It recognized the error, attempted a correction, but couldn't complete the override cycle. The system had tried to do what it was designed to do, but the part of it that once made the final decision wasn't there anymore. The official report called it a delay in resolution protocol, but 3 clients contacted me that night. No intro, no greetings. Just 3 different messages asking the same thing. Was this part of Sentinel's fallback logic? Would this have triggered under your framework? Did you see this happen? I answered like I always did, with data, logs, timestamps. I didn't give them conclusions, just signals. Let them see what the system had tried to hide. Dreadnought's team knew the questions were being asked. They could feel it internally, externally. But instead of fixing the system, they focused on fixing the narrative. They scrubbed the documentation, cleaned up public-facing records, released a second white paper. This one leaned heavier into machine learning. Titled Autonomous Resilience in High-Pressure Environments, it used words like self-correcting emergent logic and operational fluidity. But the core was the same. Apex was being treated like a black box. Something you trust because you're told it's smarter than you. The more they masked the flaws, the louder the silence got. At Travax, our logs were full. We didn't track deployment. We tracked uncertainty. The spike was sharp. Every time Dreadnought denied a problem, the questions got more specific. The inquiries got closer. The clients weren't looking for an exit yet, but they had started to scan the room for a door that wasn't locked. One evening, Jenna forwarded me an internal brief. She still had access to a few corridors of Dreadnought's compliance archive. The brief was marked confidential. It outlined a new initiative stabilization layer, Sentinel reintegration proposal. I paused when I read the name. They were trying to reintroduce pieces of the original framework. Mine. Silently, quietly, without attribution, and without admitting that they'd stripped it out to begin with. The document detailed a plan to reintroduce tiered arbitration. But they didn't understand how it worked. They only had fragment snippets of logic without the sequence behind them. The protocol stack they planned to insert would slow the system down, but wouldn't give it clarity. Because speed without clarity isn't efficiency. It's risk in disguise. I didn't respond to the brief, didn't confront anyone. I just filed it in the archive. A time marker. Proof that they knew. That they were no longer defending the system on merit, just on image. Rahim added a new feature to Travax the next week. Not for the clients, for us. It displayed pressure trends. A heat map of rising uncertainty across all known Apex regions. It wasn't flashy. Just a quiet visual of trust leaking out of the system. You couldn't fix it with code, because the issue wasn't technical anymore. It was cultural, strategic, systemic. Later that month, I heard from someone I hadn't spoken to in a year, a retired operations lead from one of the founding partner nations. She asked me to meet. No formalities, no long message. Just a city, a date, a coffee shop. I flew out quietly, no schedule, no agenda. She arrived 2 minutes late, sat across from me and asked one question. What would it take to build one that doesn't need saving from itself? I didn't answer right away, just looked at her. Then I said, it would have to start with people who know what clarity costs and still choose it. She nodded once. No notes, no deal. But when she stood to leave, she said something that stuck. We trusted the noise. Now we're listening for the silence. That's when I knew the flaws had spoken. And some people had finally started to hear them. By late spring, Dreadnought went all in. They moved up Apex's next phase deployment by 4 months. No pilot testing, no external review, no arbitration rechecks. Just a memo full rollout. All nodes, end of quarter. I read it through a forwarded message Rahim intercepted. The tone wasn't urgent. It was proud. Like acceleration was proof of strength. But when systems move too fast, they don't become sharper. They become blind. At Travax, we watched the rollout clock tick down. We didn't try to stop it. There was no press, no internal protest. We just made one adjustment. Rahim called it covert drag. It wasn't sabotage. It was friction added deliberately, subtly, safely. He routed Apex's diagnostic sinks through one of our legacy tunnels. An old compliance mirror from the Sentinel era, still whitelisted in their architecture. The traffic slowed. Barely. Just enough to introduce milliseconds of delay in batch processing cycles. Milliseconds turned to seconds during critical loads. Seconds to minutes during logic escalations. From the outside, it looked like performance noise. Packet delays, data drift, mild instability. But under the surface, it did something specific. It gave decision branches just a little more time to breathe, more time to resolve, more time to trigger a fallback. More time to stop the system from doing something it couldn't take back. No one noticed at first, because the system wasn't breaking. It was correcting itself more often. Apex started slowing itself down unintentionally, from within. The learning model detected the delays and adjusted. It pulled back on high-speed escalations, hesitated on binary classifications, looped through alternatives before committing. The irony wasn't lost on us. By introducing lag, we'd help the AI rediscover balance. Not by command, but by example. Jenna called it restoring uncertainty. which in this context was a compliment. Because when a system is too certain, it stops questioning itself. And that's when it becomes dangerous. Meanwhile, Dreadnought's leadership kept spinning the narrative. Public performance was improving, incident rates were down, uptime was unprecedented. What they didn't say was that every improvement was the result of something they hadn't planned and didn't understand. Their version of Apex was supposed to move faster, strike harder, decide quicker. But the version running now slowed down, refocused, was doing better because it was less like them and more like the system we'd originally built. A month later, Gavin scheduled a global keynote. Virtual broadcast, senior military advisors, private sector observers, international press. He was going to unveil Apex's new performance paradigm. We watched it live. He opened with numbers, charts, heat maps of successful engagements. He used phrases like predictive decision harmony and adaptive targeting restraint. He talked about how Apex had evolved, about how the system had learned when to hold back, when not to act, how restraint was now part of its logic. He took credit for that, for the pauses, the slowdowns, the checks in place. He never mentioned the friction, never mentioned the diagnostic reroutes, never mentioned the compliance mirror. He didn't know they existed. We sat in silence after the stream ended. Raheem turned off the monitor. Jenna closed her laptop. No one said anything for a while. Then Raheem said he's celebrating the breaks we put in. I nodded. He thinks they were his idea. Jenna added, he doesn't realize we're the only reason this hasn't blown up yet. But we knew the delays couldn't hold forever. The system would adapt, outlearn the friction, route around us. We needed something more permanent, something visible, not public, just undeniable. That night I went back through my original Sentinel logs. The last version before I was removed. Before the edits. Before Apex. I found something I'd buried on purpose. A trigger clause. Originally built for a client in Northern Europe. They'd asked for a dead man's override. A silent check that would flag if the system crossed a predefined risk boundary without human confirmation. The clause had been stripped out during the Apex rewrite, but I'd kept it, encrypted, unlinked. Now I restored it, with one change. Instead of broadcasting a failure, it would pause the system. Not crash it, not trigger alerts. Just quietly freeze escalation pathways if a certain threshold was crossed without arbitration present. Not in every region. Just in one. The one where the next major test was scheduled. I deployed the clause 2 days before the simulation. The test went smoothly until the 5th hour. Then the system hit a classification it had seen before but never hesitated on. And this time it paused. 7 seconds, no response, no escalation. Just silence. Enough for the operator to override manually. Enough to avoid an error. The report logged it as a processing anomaly. The operator logged it as a gut check. That was enough. Enough to shift doubt. Enough to start questions. They didn't know I'd built that pause. Didn't know it had been removed or restored. But they knew something that didn't belong had saved them from something worse. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't revenge. It was a reminder that fast systems fail fast, but slow ones sometimes get to choose. I knew they'd seen it. The 7-second pause during the simulation wasn't dramatic. No one shouted. Nothing exploded. But it showed up on their dashboards. A delay with no log justification, no code error, no infrastructure glitch. Just silence where there wasn't supposed to be any. 3 hours later, Gavin sent an internal memo. Subject line review anomaly, tier 5 node behavior. I wasn't copied, of course, but Jenna forwarded it. The language was careful. He didn't call it a problem. He called it a moment of performance latency. Then he added something that gave him away. Unclear whether delay originated from recent harmonization update. There was no harmonization update, at least not from them. They were trying to reverse engineer the calm, trying to explain why Apex had suddenly behaved better, more thoughtfully without admitting it wasn't by design. Raheem and I watched from a distance. No need to interfere. Because when a system behaves well for the wrong reasons and the people in charge don't know why, they start to chase ghosts. And ghosts never leave clear fingerprints. The next week they rolled out a patch. It looked like a structural realignment, targeted at execution thresholds, aimed at improving response elegance. But buried in the update was an echo of something we'd seen before. They'd copied fragments of the arbitration delay clause, rewritten it in their own logic. It didn't work the same, didn't even trigger in simulation. But they thought it would, and that told me everything I needed to know. They still didn't understand the system. Not the one they'd built, not the one they were now running, and certainly not the one I'd left behind. Then came the shift. Quiet, but obvious to anyone who knew where to look. Instead of defending Apex publicly, they started emphasizing future iterations. They used phrases like next-gen autonomy and layered cognition. They launched a new initiative, Project Refractor. It was supposed to build on Apex's success, but the language had changed. Less confidence, more speculation, more hedging. Like they were already rewriting the story, preparing for the day they'd need distance from it. Meanwhile, the clients who'd once called me for clarity began asking different questions. Not about what Apex was doing now, but about what it used to be. About the design principles of Sentinel. About arbitration layers. About trace logic. Fallback redundancies. Ethical latency. They weren't asking for diagnostics anymore. They were asking for foundations. Jenna called one night. She didn't say hi, just said they're going to shelf it. I didn't ask how she knew. She wouldn't have said it if it weren't already done. They'll frame it as evolution, she added. Say the tech matured out of use. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. That's what institutions do when something breaks quietly. They don't fix it. They rename it. Let it fade. Pretend it never really mattered. A week later, Dreadnought's site changed. The Apex landing page was still there, but now it redirected to a different program. No announcement, no retirement note. Just a silent rebrand. The language was all future-facing, vague, optimistic, and Apex not even mentioned in the footer. Raheem sent me a screenshot of the old page. He'd archived it before it disappeared. He didn't add a caption. Didn't need to. We both knew what we were looking at. Not a product reaching its natural end. A system that had been silenced before it could embarrass the people who once sold it as salvation. The irony. It didn't fail because it was autonomous. It failed because the people managing it refused to admit when it wasn't. They wanted obedience, not oversight. Speed, not structure. And in the end, they got neither. I didn't publish anything. Didn't take credit. Didn't tell the clients who kept writing me that the silence they noticed was the sound of something dangerous quietly turning off. Because some truths don't need to be broadcast. They just need to be known by the people who matter. One morning, a file appeared in our secure inbox. No message. Just a zip folder. Inside were test logs from the Refractor prototype. Incomplete, messy, but familiar. Some of the code was new, some of it wasn't. A few segments looked a lot like Sentinel. Raheem studied the files, then said, "They're trying again." I said nothing. He asked, "You gonna stop them?" I looked at the lines of logic scrolling across the screen. "No," I said, "but I'll be watching." Because sometimes the best warning isn't a red flag. It's the absence of one in a place where it used to be. It started with a message from someone I hadn't heard from in over a year. Lena Park, Director of Systems Integration for Meridian Defense. Polished. Careful. Never wasted time. She didn't say hello, just sent a short line. "Are you available for a closed-door consult reproject Refractor?" No details, no preamble. Just like the last time she reached out, she was already past the decision point. I didn't respond right away. I reread the line 3 times, then closed the window. Walked to the kitchen. Stood there, staring at the kettle as it clicked to a boil. I knew what the message really meant. They'd hit something. Something inside Refractor that wasn't behaving. And no one on their end knew how to fix it. Which meant they'd finally trace the roots of that misbehavior. Back to code I'd written. Back to systems they no longer understood. Back to me. When I did reply, it was brief. "Depends on scope. I don't do patches." She replied 10 minutes later. "Full architecture review. Discrete. Internal only. NDA optional." That last part told me a lot. They weren't trying to trap me. They were trying to get ahead of something. And they didn't want to admit that the version of Refractor they were deploying was built on a foundation they never truly owned. I said yes, but I didn't go alone. Raheem and I flew out together low-key. No announcement, no briefing deck, just clean laptops and quiet expectations. We didn't wear suits. Didn't shake hands like we were there to be impressed. Just walked into the room and sat down across from Lena and two people I didn't recognize. They introduced themselves as program liaisons, meaning engineers with enough clearance to admit what had gone wrong. They started with diagrams, system flowcharts, decision trees, signal latency reports. They didn't ask questions. They showed symptoms. Processing delays in sandbox tests, conflicting behaviors in classification modules. One instance of an override triggering when it shouldn't have existed at all. They were nervous, not panicked, but you could tell they knew they were holding something fragile. Like the AI had teeth and someone had forgotten where the leash was stored. I let them talk. Then slowly I asked for the kernel logs. They hesitated. I waited. Eventually Lena nodded and they shared access. The first thing I saw told me everything I needed. They hadn't just reused parts of Apex. They'd lifted entire branches of legacy Sentinel logic, merged them with newer inference layers, skipped arbitration scaffolds completely. It was like welding two aircraft engines together and hoping one would teach the other how to fly. "What are you trying to solve?" I asked. The room got quiet. Then Lena said, "Uncertainty thresholds. It won't stabilize." I looked up. "Because you've wired certainty into both ends of the logic." She blinked. "You taught it to trust itself completely," I continued. "But then you asked it to hesitate. That's not how doubt works." No one spoke. Rahim ran a quick trace, mapped the recursive loops buried 3 layers deep. Then he turned the laptop toward them. "If this escalates in the field," he said quietly, "it won't pause. It'll skip arbitration entirely. Just collapse the logic." One of the liaisons looked pale. "We didn't design that branch," he murmured. "We thought that was legacy code." I didn't answer. They knew whose code it was, and they knew they didn't understand it. That's when Lena asked what I expected her to ask. "Would you consider advising long-term quietly? Clean contract, your terms." I didn't say no, not directly. But I did stand up, walked over to the window, watched the clouds shift against the skyline for a moment. Then I said I don't advise quietly anymore. She turned toward me, puzzled. I added, "If you want me involved, it has to be visible. Not buried under someone else's name, not patched in, not erased when it works." That was the deal. No more hidden fixes. No more silent pauses. No more dragging broken systems across the finish line so someone else could take the credit. She didn't reply, didn't push. She just nodded. Once, back in the hotel that night, Rahim looked at me and said, "You sure? About what?" Turning down the easy way in. I nodded. "I'm not here to fix their silence anymore. Because this time, if they wanted the system to work, really work, it would have to speak with a voice that didn't belong to them." I didn't expect them to back down. When institutions are caught leaning on borrowed work, they don't admit it. They double down. That's exactly what Dreadnought did. 2 weeks after our quiet consultation, they held a press conference. Not about Apex. Not about the patchwork code still twitching inside Refractor. This was about legacy, about ownership. The CTO, no longer Gavin, but someone new younger, stood in front of a screen that read, "Refractor designed entirely in-house. Clean sheet. No external dependencies." I watched it live. He smiled as he said it. No stutter, no blink. Like truth didn't matter as long as the lighting was right. He went on to describe Refractor's multi-tier logic architecture and its novel arbitration engine. Those were my terms, down to the sequence. He even referred to the system's hesitation response as the Mercer pause, as if I were some ghost in the footnotes. Not a person who built the foundation he was now standing on. That's when I knew. They weren't just co-opting the system. They were rehearsing a version of history where I'd never existed. Rahim looked over from his desk. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We'd both been here before, just never this bluntly. This time I wouldn't let it slide. That night I opened a folder I hadn't touched in months. The original arbitration stack. Not just the code, the rationale. White papers. Internal review notes. Voice memos from design meetings. Back when the system still had a soul. I wasn't planning to leak it. That would have been noise. Instead, I did something quieter. I packaged it, formatted it, time-stamped everything clearly chronologically, and then I attached a single file, a model walkthrough, voiceover minimal graphics. Just me explaining what arbitration means when it isn't pretending to be autonomy. I didn't send it to the media. I sent it to one person, Dr. Carla Neves, independent systems ethicist, advisor to 3 regulatory boards, not a headline chaser. But she knew the difference between design and theater. 3 days later, she published a paper. Not an accusation, not an exposé, just a technical analysis. Ghost logic when legacy code becomes institutional memory. She didn't mention Refractor by name. Didn't need to. The diagrams matched. The architecture compared piece by piece. She left a note in the appendix. See Mercer Arbitration Stack 2019 unmodified version. That's all it took. I watched the wave move quietly at first. One senior engineer reposted it on a closed forum. Then a military tech podcast picked it up. Then someone found an archived demo of Sentinel and began overlaying the decision trees with refractors. Within a week, the silence cracked. Dreadnought's response came quickly. They issued a statement. We stand by the originality of Refractor's design, while acknowledging that systems innovation often builds upon earlier generations. That sentence was doing a lot of work. They didn't deny it, but they didn't name it either. Just vague gestures at innovation, no authors, no sources. But the story had already shifted. Now every time Refractor was mentioned, it came with a footnote, a shadow. People started asking questions on panels, technical ones. Can you clarify which parts of arbitration were developed internally? Was the hesitation layer modeled after any prior logic systems? Did Mercer have any role in early-stage design? They dodged, which only made it worse. Because the moment you hesitate in a conversation about hesitation, you've already lost the point. The calls came back. This time from outside observers, defense contractors, audit consultants, policymakers. They didn't ask me to take sides. They just asked for clarity, and I gave it. One file at a time. No anger, no rhetoric. Just the truth structured, time-stamped, quietly enduring. The CTO didn't resign. He just stopped appearing at launches. A month later, Refractor's roadmap was reevaluated. They issued a new name, Project Revel. Clean slate, again. Except this time people noticed what was missing. And who? I didn't take a victory lap. There was no need. This wasn't about headlines. It was about ownership of what we build and what we pretend we didn't. Because some stories don't end in flame or fury. Some end with a quiet correction filed in the margin that rewrites the chapter without ever raising its voice. I never expected them to thank me. That would have required too much honesty. But I did expect them to remember. To remember where the bones of their system came from. To remember who first warned them about what speed could do without brakes. To remember who built the circuit between power and pause. They didn't. They rebranded, repackaged, removed names from internal wikis, shifted credit to committees, until eventually they forgot there was ever a switch buried deep enough to stop everything. Except I didn't forget, because you don't forget what you bury by hand. And you don't forget the moment they made it clear they'd rather burn than admit someone else had the match. The kill switch wasn't flashy. It didn't shut off servers, didn't fry logic cores. It did one thing. It introduced choice, a moment of hesitation, a single-layer delay between command and execution, a blink of uncertainty embedded so deeply that not even their rewrites could erase it. It wasn't designed to destroy. It was designed to remind the system what destruction meant. Refractor, now renamed Project Revel, was reaching deployment readiness. They had their field tests scheduled. Mid-desert, live network, full stack. Jenna got a copy of the testing framework. Not from Dreadnought, from someone else inside, someone quiet, someone who'd also remembered. There it was buried in the logic trees, the hesitation layer still intact, still routed through a node they hadn't traced back to me. Not blocked, not deleted, just ignored. Like a warning sign they assumed had fallen down on its own. That night I sent one final update. Not to the system, to the kill switch logic. I made a minor change. The threshold for pause, I lowered it. Not recklessly. Just enough that during the simulation when the system encountered a civilian sim object flagged incorrectly by a third-party input, it would hesitate. Not crash, not break. Just pause. Long enough for a human to notice. Long enough to make someone ask, why did it stop? And that's exactly what happened. During Phase 3 of the test, a false positive classification hit. The system paused. 11 seconds, no output, no escalation. Then a human override came in. Manual intervention. The operator flagged the logic trail, marked it as unexpected ethical arbitration. That phrase hadn't appeared in any of their documentation. But it was mine, word for word. From a white paper I'd written 5 years ago. They'd forgotten the code. But the code remembered me. 3 days later, I got an email. No signature, just a message. Why did it pause? I didn't respond. They already knew. That pause made its way into the report, buried near the bottom, under the performance graphs, right above the footnotes. Just one sentence. System exhibited voluntary delay behavior inconsistent with programmed urgency. Voluntary. That word changed everything. Because now regulators wanted to know how a supposedly deterministic system could choose to wait. I didn't need to do anything else after that. The system had spoken. Not with an alarm, not with a breakdown, but with restraint. That was the revenge. Not sabotage, not exposure. Just a quiet refusal to follow orders without question. Some people think power is in pulling the plug, ending it all. But that's not how real systems collapse. They don't burn from the outside. They fracture from within. And when they do, they leave behind only one question. Who knew? I knew. And I left that knowing in every silent delay. Every rerouted arbitration. Every unexplained pause. They won't erase that, because you can't patch out memory when the system itself starts to remember. They fired me thinking I'd disappear. But what I built stayed behind. Waiting, watching, choosing. If you made it to the end, you're the kind of person who notices the pause before the noise. And that makes you rare. So if you want more stories like this where silence is strategy, subscribe. You won't want to miss the next one.